So picture this. It is November of 1572, and you look up at the night sky, and you see something honestly kind of terrifying.
Oh, absolutely terrifying for anyone back then.
Right. There's this brand new star right in the constellation of Cassiopeia. And it's not just a faint little dot. It burns brighter than Vega, then it outshines Sirius.
I mean, it got so luminous you could literally step outside at high noon and see it with your naked eye.
Which is just wild to think about. But then, over the next year and a half, it slowly fades out and vanishes entirely.
Poof, gone.
Exactly. Now, for an 18th century philosopher named Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, that dying star wasn't just like an interesting astronomical anomaly. To him, it was absolute, undeniable proof that the physical universe was inherently unstable.
Inherently unstable and, frankly, constantly on the brink of catastrophic collapse.
Right. And he believed it was being held together only by an invisible thread.
Yeah, and that historical moment perfectly encapsulates the philosophical ambition we are looking at today. St. Martin's 1782 masterwork, Tableau Naturel, or a natural picture of the relationships between God, man, and the universe. He uses events exactly like that supernova to argue a really radical point.
And what's the core of that point?
Well, he believed that the profound truths of existence, like the actual intent behind the cosmos, they aren't encrypted away where humanity can't reach them. We aren't being kept in the dark by the prime mover.
So it's not a secret game of hide and seek.
No, not at all. Instead, he argued that universal truths are woven into the very mechanics of reality itself. He described this as a thread of light that's constantly offered to us.
A thread of light spanning from the human mind all the way out to the outer edges of the galaxy. And honestly, that is our specific mission for this deep dive. We're taking St. Martin's incredibly dense, fascinating 18th century text, and we're grabbing hold of that thread.
It's quite the thread to pull on, too.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because we want to decode his concept of correspondence, this profound link between human agency and the divine order. And the sheer scale of his ambition is just infectious. I mean, he's trying to prove the invisible architecture of the entire universe using everything from human thought to literal stars in the sky.
It's massive. And, if you want to understand the vast divine cosmos, St. Martin suggests you can't just start by, looking through a telescope.
Right, you can't just look up.
Exactly. You have to start by examining how we operate. The thread of light is meant to draw humanity back to its creator, reuniting the material world with its intellectual origin. But to grasp it, we first have to understand the true nature of human capability.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to understand how the massive divine universe was made, St. Martin establishes a baseline by looking at how humans create things.
Right.
We move from the deeply personal to the grandly cosmic. And he uses this analogy of an architect, which really serves as the bedrock of his argument for mind over matter.
It's a brilliant analogy because before any human being brings material work into existence, like, say, erecting a complex building, a highly specific sequence of invisible actions has to take place first.
Like the planning phase.
Exactly. An architect conceives the plan, adopts the thought of it, and then deliberately chooses the means to realize it. And all of these faculties, these creative powers, they operate entirely internally.
They don't exist in the physical world yet.
Right. They have no physical weight, no mass, and they are completely invisible to anyone else looking at the architect.
And the really fascinating takeaway here is that those invisible faculties are vastly superior to the physical result. Like, if I translate this into a modern context, just to show you how the mechanism works, think about writing complex software code or a chef creating a master recipe.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right, because the physical manifestation, the computer hardware running the program, or the plated dish of food, it's just a highly vulnerable end result.
Very vulnerable. It can be destroyed in a second.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If there's a massive hardware failure and the computer is destroyed, or if the meal is just eaten, the invisible faculty doesn't die with it.
No, of course not.
The underlying logic in the programmer's mind, or those structural ratios of the recipe in the chef's head, they remain completely untouched. They are indestructible relative to the physical object.
Yeah, the physical destruction of the building or the computer, it doesn't erase the capability that generated it in the first place. The faculties that made the creator capable of the work remain exactly what they were, before, during, and after the physical object's lifespan.
There's a permanent capability.
Right. And St. Martin pushes this even further. He notes that having the power to destroy a building, but actively choosing not to destroy it, is a continuous act of creation.
Wait, really? Just deciding not to knock it down?
Yes. The invisible intellect is actively sustaining the physical structure just by deciding to maintain it.
Wow, that totally reframes how you look at the built environment around you.
Mm.
A skyscraper isn't just a stack of steel and glass. It's the projection of an invisible, deliberative thought actively taking up physical space.
Precisely. And this highlights the crucial distinction St. Martin draws between our physical senses and our intellect. Our senses operate purely by impulse.
Like a reflex.
Yeah, they absorb whatever is in front of them without any judgment. But our intellectual being acts by deliberation. Our invisible intellect wields actual power over our physical senses, directing them and expanding their utility through conscious willpower.
So the mind is driving the car, basically.
Exactly. And he uses geometry to illustrate this. Physical shapes, they satisfy our visual senses. But they're true numbers. The absolute mathematical relations that govern them, those are completely beyond sensory perception.
You can't see the math.
Right. Those relations exist strictly in the realm of thought.
So the physical senses act as the raw data gatherers, while the intellect operates as the underlying processing engine making sense of all those inputs.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
Which brings us to the core implication of this architect analogy. If our human actions, our buildings, our software, our recipes, if they derive their existence from superior invisible powers held in our minds, then St. Martin scales this right up to the material universe itself.
He goes massive with it.
He really does. If human creations are the visible work of invisible faculties, the infinitely more complex creation of general nature must logically be the product of vastly superior invisible powers that exist completely independent of the material universe.
Yeah, because the physical components of the universe comprehend the faculties that created them, no more than, like, the bricks of a house comprehend the mind of the architect who laid out the blueprint.
It's a huge philosophical leap, but the internal logic holds up perfectly. However, establishing that an invisible force created the material world is really only half the battle here.
Right. Creation is one thing.
Yeah. He takes this out of the realm of abstract thought and looks up at the cosmos to prove that an invisible force must actively sustain the world right now.
And this is where we return to his astronomical proof. He asks us to look at the cosmos as a witness. And he poses a very specific question about the mechanics of the planets. Why do the planets, which are constantly drawn toward a central point of gravity, not eventually just crash into that center?
Right, because if everything is being constantly pulled toward a common center, you would naturally assume it all eventually clumps together into one fiery, chaotic mass.
Exactly. And St. Martin argues that mutual physical attraction is totally insufficient to explain why this collapse hasn't happened. His reasoning is based on the constant motion of the celestial bodies.
Because they never start moving.
Right. Because planets are always moving, their daily positions relative to each other are infinitely varying. So if the solar system relied purely on a mechanical, physical balance of gravity, that constant shifting of mass and distance should have compounded into a fatal error a long time ago.
Like a structural failure.
Yes. The shifting would disrupt the equilibrium and cause a cascading structural failure across the solar system.
Wait, I have to challenge this based on the timeline, though, because he wrote this in 1782, right?
Yes, 1782.
Okay, so Newton's Principia, detailing the laws of motion and universal gravitation that had been out for nearly a century. We have the math for orbital mechanics. Why inject, intent into a system that just runs predictably on physics?
What's fascinating here is that if we look closely at the history of 18th century science, even Newton himself struggled with this exact issue.
Really? Newton doubted it.
Oh, yeah. It was known as the n-body problem. Calculating the gravitational pull between two bodies, like the sun and the Earth, that was mathematically clean. But once you add the gravitational pulls of Jupiter, Saturn, and all the other moving planets, the math becomes totally chaotic.
Oh, because they're all tugging on each other simultaneously.
Exactly. The gravitational interferences compound over time. Newton actually believed that these accumulated planetary perturbations would eventually destabilize the solar system. He thought it would require God to occasionally intervene and reset the orbits.
Wow, I had no idea Newton believed that.
Yeah. So St. Martin is operating perfectly within the scientific context of his day. He's pointing out that mechanical laws alone, left to their own blind devices in a system constantly in motion, they're inherently unstable.
So mechanics without intent eventually leads to collapse, which I assume brings us back to that 1572 supernova.
You got it. The supernova serves as his empirical evidence of this instability. Historically, philosophers relied on the quote-unquote fixed stars,
The distant background stars that never seem to move.
Right, to provide a stable anchor for the universe. But the supernova in Cassiopeia proved undeniably that the fixed stars are not fixed at all. They undergo violent revolutions. They die.
They literally explode.
Yeah, and St. Martin's logic here is sharply mechanical. If even a single star changes mass or vanishes, it alters the gravitational pull in its entire region. It fundamentally disrupts the local harmony.
A shift in mass in one region changes the gravitational math for all the neighboring regions.
Exactly. And once local harmony is disrupted in a purely physical system, that error should ripple outward. The stars should basically yield to general attraction and drag the entire system into a progressive, destructive collapse.
But we're still here.
Exactly. Yet, as St. Martin observes, we don't see the universe tearing itself apart. A visible order always reigns before our eyes. Therefore, the physical mechanics must be governed by an invisible physical force superior to the stars, actively sustaining their balance in space.
Much like the architect actively chooses to sustain the building instead of destroying it.
Bingo.
The intent of the invisible intellect actively prevents the physical structure from collapsing under its own weight.
That is such a fascinating transition, because if the external physical universe requires an invisible force to sustain its order, the immediate logical crisis is whether our own minds are subject to that same external control.
Right. It gets very personal very quickly.
It does. He pivots from the macrophysics of the stars down to the micromechanics of human thought. And he demands an explanation for the origin of our abstract ideas. Now, St. Martin readily acknowledges that we derive physical ideas from our senses. If a person has never encountered a tree, they cannot possess the sensory idea of a tree.
That makes sense. We rely entirely on physical objects communicating their impressions to our visual or tactile receptors.
Right. Data input is required to process physical reality.
Yeah, data in, data out.
But he draws a sharp line when it comes to a completely different class of ideas, concepts that have no physical counterpart in nature whatsoever.
Like what?
Well, how do humans possess the concept of a universal law, or the abstract idea of order, or the notion of a supreme unity guiding the cosmos?
Right, because you can't touch universal law. You can't put supreme unity under a microscope. Even if you look at, purely secular philosophy or atheism, you find this relentless pursuit of an astonishing, unifying theory of everything.
Oh, constantly.
The desire to find a single equation that explains all of reality is totally universal. It's an inherent search for grand unity.
And his point is that no physical object in the sensory world could possibly generate those concepts within us. To further the point, think about animals. They exist in the exact same sensory environment that we do.
Right. Same trees, same dirt.
They navigate the exact same physical objects, yet they display absolutely no indication of contemplating universal law or divine order. So, since humans cannot create a complex idea entirely out of nothing, and the physical world cannot teach us about supreme unity, we must be receiving these concepts from an external, intelligent source.
Okay, if I can map this onto another analogy here. It suggests the human mind is essentially a highly sophisticated radio receiver.
I like that.
Because St. Martin mentions we carry the germ of all ideas. It implies we're built with the intricate hardware capable of processing these vast concepts. But we are just sitting in silence, waiting for an external broadcast to animate those ideas. We require a signal from the outside.
That distinction between possessing the receiver and generating the transmission is vital, and St. Martin offers very practical proof that we do not author our own transmissions.
What's the proof?
Just consider how often a person intends to focus their intellect on a specific, complex task, only to be constantly interrupted by a barrage of involuntary, distracting, or unwelcome thoughts.
Oh, man. Anyone trying to do deep, focused work experiences this constantly. You try to concentrate on a complicated problem, and suddenly your brain insists on analyzing a conversation you had 5 years ago, or, wondering if you locked the front door.
Exactly. If we were the absolute masters and solitary authors of our intellectual domain, our minds would be perfectly disciplined.
We'd never get distracted.
We would only think exactly what we chose to think, precisely when we chose to think it. The reality that we are pursued by disordered or entirely foreign ideas, despite our conscious efforts to banish them, it proves our minds act as passive receivers to external reactions.
We are biological receivers swimming in a sea of signals.
Which connects directly back to the prime mover. Just as the physical universe provides incontestable proof of an active physical creator sustaining it, our internal intellectual universe provides proof of a thinking intellectual creator feeding us these concepts of order.
We're deeply dependent on an intelligent source outside of us.
Very dependent.
So what does this all mean? I mean, if you are listening and following this logic, your alarm bells might be ringing right now. If an external force is holding the physical universe together, and an external intelligence is broadcasting thoughts into our minds, where is human agency? Are we just biological puppets?
That's the big question.
It forces us directly into St. Martin's ultimate philosophical destination, which is the paradox of liberty and human free will.
And the question of liberty really is the crucible of his entire theory. Because, like you said, if we depend on the prime mover for both our physical existence and our conceptual ideas, freedom seems impossible.
Totally impossible.
But St. Martin navigates this by defining two vastly different types of liberty. He calls them foundational liberty and liberty as an effect.
Okay, let's define the mechanics of foundational liberty first.
So, foundational liberty is the raw, mechanical power of choice. It's an inherent attribute of the human essence. It gives us the ability to examine the various signals presented to our minds, weigh them, and decide how to act.
Okay.
Crucially, though, foundational liberty includes the faculty to act in direct opposition to our own highest nature.
Oh, interesting.
It is the capacity to follow destructive habits, yield to base impulses, and make choices that actively degrade our purpose. We retain this raw power of choice, even while making ourselves subservient to those lower influences.
So it's basically the freedom to touch the hot stove, even when you possess the knowledge that it will absolutely burn you.
Exactly.
But then he introduces liberty as an effect, which he considers true freedom. He argues this only occurs when a human aligns perfectly with divine law, completely exempt from any contrary lower influences. Now, I have to admit, I struggle with this a bit.
Oh, why is that?
Because to a modern ear, being free usually means doing whatever the heck you want. The ability to just act without anyone imposing rules on you. St. Martin seems to be arguing that true freedom is actually perfect obedience to a set of laws. That feels like a total contradiction.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the friction you're feeling there is the very core of the paradox. St. Martin would analyze our modern concept of doing whatever you want and argue that it is frequently just slavery disguised as autonomy.
Slavery to what?
To your passions. If your actions are entirely driven by foreign impulses, like a sudden burst of anger, a craving for status, a passing distraction, you are not exercising freedom. You are simply reacting as a captive to those external signals.
Ah, I see what you mean.
True liberty as an effect, means your will is guided exclusively by the highest intellectual law inherent to your nature. You admit no motive that contradicts your true essence.
You know, the mechanics of playing an instrument actually make this click perfectly for me.
How?
Well, a musician sitting at a piano isn't exhibiting true freedom if they simply smash their hands randomly across the keys. That produces chaos, not music.
Right?
The musician only achieves true artistic freedom of expression when they align themselves perfectly with the strict mathematical rules of music theory, rhythm, and harmony. It is the perfect obedience to the governing law of the instrument that actually yields perfect freedom.
That analogy bridges the gap flawlessly, and St. Martin elevates that exact logic to the level of the creator. The prime mover, the first principle, represents the absolute pinnacle of this liberty.
Because it follows its own rules.
Because it is its own law.
Yeah.
The prime mover is infinitely free precisely because it is good by its very essence. Therefore, it can never deviate to will evil, because evil is simply that which opposes its nature.
It can't play a wrong note.
Exactly. The prime mover is never subjected to foreign impulses or distractions. It entirely lacks that disastrous human faculty, the ability to act against the purpose of its own existence.
Wow. So the foundational liberty we prize so much, the ability to make mistakes and act against our own interests, is actually a sign of our inferiority. The Creator is so completely aligned with its own perfect nature that it only continuously provides its creations with exactly what they need to maintain harmony.
It redefines the entire concept of autonomy. Freedom shifts from the raw ability to act randomly to the refined ability to act perfectly in accordance with your highest intellectual nature.
That is profound.
Yeah.
Tracing St. Martin's thread of light from the beginning, the structural integrity of his argument is just remarkable.
Right.
We examined how human thought models universal creation, like the invisible architect's mind surviving the destruction of the physical building.
Right.
We analyzed the N-body problem in the 1572 supernova, revealing that an invisible force must be actively sustaining the chaotic orbital mechanics of the cosmos. We turned inward. recognizing that our minds act as receivers for abstract concepts like universal law that the sensory world could never, ever generate.
We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. We really did. And finally, we unpack the paradox that true liberty is not random rebellion, but perfect alignment with the prime mover.
And, through all of this immense cosmic scaling, Saint-Martin maintains a deeply profound humility.
In what way?
Well, toward the conclusion of the text, he explicitly warns against attempting to subject the divinity to human calculations. He introduces this concept of the primary number. In the esoteric mathematics of his time, a number represented the fundamental vibration or the absolute measure of a being's essence.
Okay, so a numerical representation of a soul, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And Saint-Martin states that the Creator's primary number is infinite. If we filled the entire spatial universe with mathematical equations, we still wouldn't calculate a fraction of the divine essence.
It's beyond our hardware.
Completely.
Yeah.
But his vital point is that we do not need to mathematically calculate God to recognize the reality of his existence. Just as we recognize the invisible faculties of the architect without being able to weigh or measure their thoughts, we can recognize the active presence of the eternal principle in the harmony of the universe.
We cannot decipher the encrypted cipher of the architect's mind, but we can walk through the physical structure they built and know with absolute certainty that they were there.
Exactly.
It is a stunning, mathematically tinged piece of 18th century philosophy that manages to feel incredibly urgent today. And before we wrap up, we always want to leave you with something to examine on your own, something that extends the boundaries of what we've discussed today.
Yeah, and taking St. Martin's foundational analogy of the architect to its logical extreme presents a really fascinating modern dilemma.
Lead on us.
He argued that our built environments and material works are exact reflections of our internal, invisible intellectual faculties. The physical mirrors the mental. So, consider the digital architectures we are constructing today. We are building increasingly fragmented, algorithmic digital worlds designed around constant distraction, outrage, and chaos.
Oh, wow. That's a heavy thought.
Right. If our external creations perfectly mirror our internal state, what does the architecture of the modern internet suggest about the current condition of our collective intellect? In building these chaotic new digital universes, have we lost our grip on St. Martin's thread of light?
Man, if the physical universe reflects an intellect of perfect order and intent, the algorithms we design might reflect a deeply fractured human essence. Take that consideration with you. Analyze the digital structures you interact with today and ask what invisible faculties they represent. Keep looking for the underlying mechanics of the world around you and stay curious. We will catch you on the next Deep Dive.